The restaurant was her idea. I'm Ryan, 36 years old, project manager for a mid-sized construction firm. And on the evening of December 14th, I sat across from my wife at a corner table in the same restaurant where we'd had our third date 9 years earlier, watching her smile at me over a candle she had specifically requested, wearing the blue dress she knew I loved. And I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I already knew everything. Every message. Every hotel. Every Tuesday evening, she had told me she was working late while her car sat in a parking structure on Meridian Avenue 2 miles from her office. Every lie she had placed between us over the course of 11 months. Arranged as carefully as furniture, positioned so naturally that I had stopped seeing them as obstructions and started walking around them as though they had always been part of the room. I had the video on my phone, tucked inside a folder she didn't know existed, on a device she had never touched. 47 seconds of footage, shot from across a hotel lobby with a zoom that reduced everything to shapes and light, but shapes and light that were absolutely, unmistakably her and him. She had left a note on the kitchen counter that morning. I found it beside my coffee cup, written on the small notepad we kept for grocery lists, in her handwriting that I had known for a decade. Tonight is just for us. I read it standing at the counter in my work clothes. I read it a second time. Then I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket and carried it with me all day, the way you carry something that has become evidence before you fully understand what it's evidence of. She thought I was the same Ryan she had been carefully managing for the better part of a year. The Ryan who accepted explanations without pressing them, who noticed things and then talked himself out of noticing them, who had built 12 years of adult life around the assumption that the person sleeping beside him was operating in good faith. She thought that Ryan was coming to dinner. She was wrong. But she had been wrong for longer than she realized. And by December, the distance between what she believed about our marriage and what our marriage actually was had become so vast that sitting across from her at that candlelit table felt less like intimacy and more like theater, two people performing a scene that only one of them knew was the last one. That's where the story ends. But to understand why I walked into that restaurant with a video on my phone and a note in my pocket and 9 years of revised memories, you need to understand how it started. Which means going back to a Friday evening in April when I stood in our kitchen doorway and watched Emily load the dishwasher and felt, for the first time, the particular unease of a man who has noticed something he cannot yet name. We had been genuinely good together. I want to establish that clearly, because it matters for everything that follows. 9 years is not a performance sustained by inertia, or at least ours wasn't, not in the beginning. Emily and I had met at a friend's birthday gathering when we were both 27, at a rooftop bar downtown on a warm September night. And what I had felt in those first hours with her was the specific recognition of someone whose mind worked in a way that complemented mine rather than duplicated it. She was precise where I was intuitive, expressive where I tended toward reserve, socially confident in a way that I found genuinely impressive rather than intimidating. We were good in rooms together. We were good alone together. We were, for several years, a couple that other people seemed to find slightly aspirational, which is something I mention not with pride, but as context, because the contrast matters. I worked in project management for Dalton and Reeves, a construction firm that handled commercial developments across the metro area. It was demanding work, the kind that required keeping 15 variables in your head simultaneously and making decisions in real time that other people's timelines depended on. I was good at it. I had been promoted twice in 6 years and managed a team of 11 people. And the skills that made me effective there, patience, methodical thinking, the ability to hold information without acting on it prematurely, would turn out to matter in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Emily was a senior marketing coordinator at Hartwell & Crane, a mid-sized consultancy downtown that handled brand strategy for corporate clients. She had been there 6 years and had moved up steadily. The kind of professional trajectory that comes from genuine competence combined with the social intelligence to navigate an organization's informal architecture. She talked about her work with an energy that I had always found attractive, specific, engaged, occasionally funny about the absurdities of corporate culture. She was good at her job and she knew it, and that confidence was one of the things I had loved earliest about her. We had a house in Millbrook, a quiet neighborhood on the north side of the city, the kind of street where the houses are large enough to feel spacious, but not so large as to feel anonymous. We had bought it 4 years into the marriage, When the down payment we'd been saving finally made sense against the market. I handled the yard and the maintenance. Emily made the interior feel like somewhere a person would actually want to be. Plants in the right places, light managed thoughtfully, the small considered details that turn a house into a home. On Sundays, she cooked something involved and time-consuming, a habit she'd had since before we met. I handled the kitchen cleanup. We had a rhythm that was so established it had become invisible to me, the way the best functioning systems become invisible. You only notice them when they stop working. The first deviation I registered was in April. Registered in the sense of noticing, not understanding. Emily had always been someone who treated her phone with complete indifference to privacy. It lived on the kitchen counter, face up, volume audible, entirely unbothered by who might glance at it. She took calls with me in the room without lowering her voice. If a message came in while we were watching television, she'd read it aloud if it was interesting. That openness had been consistent for 9 years. Not a policy, just her nature. She had nothing to conceal and therefore concealed nothing. And over nearly a decade, that transparency had become part of the texture of our life together. Sometime around April it changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have looked like anything to an outside observer. The phone started coming to bed. It started going into the bathroom. When it buzzed during dinner, she would glance at it with a composure that was fractionally too managed. The specific neutrality of someone who has decided in advance how they will look when a certain kind of notification arrives. She started turning the screen face down on the counter, a gesture so small and so easily explainable that I would have been embarrassed to mention it. I noticed, and I talked myself out of what I had noticed. This is something I have examined carefully since, because it was the first of several moments where I had accurate information and chose not to use it. Chose, specifically, the version of reality that cost less. The truth was sitting right there. The phone behavior, considered alongside anything else, would have meant something. But considered in isolation, on an ordinary April evening with dinner in the oven and no other evidence in hand, it could mean anything. Stress at work. A personal conversation she didn't want to share. Something minor. I was good at finding the innocent explanation, and for a long time that skill worked against me. I said nothing. She continued. Spring moved forward. She began staying later at work. This emerged gradually, the way Emily managed most changes, not as a single new fact, but as a slow drift that became the new normal before I had properly registered it happening. One late evening became 2 per week. Home by 6 became home by 7:30, then sometimes 8. The explanations were always professionally coherent. A campaign entering its final push, a client who required evening availability, a team restructure generating friction that needed managing. I worked in an industry where project timelines created unpredictable hours, so I had no natural instinct to find late evenings suspicious. I accepted them. She started going to the gym on Saturday mornings, which was new. Emily had talked about it intermittently for years, but had never established a consistent habit. Now, suddenly, she was going every week, leaving at 8:30 and returning just before noon. I was glad for her. I told her so. She seemed pleased by my support in a way that, in retrospect, had a slightly relieved quality to it. Not the pleasure of a person receiving encouragement, but something closer to the relief of a person whose cover story has been accepted. Small things appeared without explanation. A new moisturizer in the bathroom that wasn't her usual brand. A pair of earrings on the dresser that she wore twice and then stopped wearing, a style I had a vague memory of her saying she didn't like. A shade of lipstick slightly different from her usual. None of these things mean anything individually. I know that. I knew it then. But the accumulation of small things that don't fit the established pattern, that accumulation is its own kind of data, even when you're not ready to read it as such. There was a Friday in late May when I came home to find her sitting on the back porch with her knees pulled up, looking at the yard. She wasn't on her phone. She wasn't reading. She was just sitting there in the late afternoon light with an expression I couldn't quite categorize. I got 2 beers from the kitchen and sat beside her and asked if she was okay. She said she was just tired, and she smiled when she said it. A real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes, and leaned her shoulder against mine. We sat there for maybe 40 minutes without talking very much. I remember thinking, we're fine. I remember the specific quality of that belief, the ease of it, the way it settled into the evening. That was probably the last moment I was entirely inside the marriage I thought I had. Everything after it, I understand now, was already different. I just hadn't been told yet. The name Mark entered our house in early July. It arrived the way significant things always arrive when someone is managing you carefully, casually, contextually, embedded in something larger so it doesn't catch on anything. He was a new senior account manager at Hartwell and Crane, brought in to lead a restructured team that Emily was part of. He had strong opinions about creative direction, apparently. He'd made a joke at an all-hands meeting that Emily found funny enough to repeat over dinner. I listened. I said it was funny. I filed the name in the category of things that require nothing from you. It came up again the following week. And the week after that. By August, Mark had become a low-level recurring presence in Emily's work conversation. Not prominent. She was careful about that. He appeared the way a supporting character appears in a story someone is editing. Present enough to seem natural, not so present as to demand attention. A team lunch, mentioned collectively. A conference call that had run long, with Mark cited as the reason for a point of contention. A professional observation about his approach to client presentations, offered in the neutral register of a colleague describing another colleague. I wasn't suspicious of Mark specifically. Not yet. What I was experiencing was something harder to define, a low-frequency unease that had no single source, a gathering atmospheric pressure that I kept releasing through the valve of reasonable explanation. The phone behavior, the late evenings, the gym schedule, the small unexplained purchases, and now this name that kept surfacing. Each element, addressed individually, was manageable. It was only when I stopped addressing them individually and let them exist together, all at once, that they became something else. I didn't let them exist together for a long time. That was a choice. I'm clear on that now. September arrived, and with it a Thursday evening that rearranged everything. Emily had texted me at 4 o'clock to say she'd be late. A client presentation the following morning. She needed to stay for final prep with the team. I texted back, "No problem, good luck tomorrow." I meant it. I came home at 6, made dinner for 1. Pasta, simple, eaten at the kitchen counter while I checked emails, watched most of a game, went to bed around 10 because I had an early site visit. Emily came in sometime after midnight. I half surfaced when she got into bed, that shallow semi-consciousness of someone disturbed but not fully woken. She was careful, quiet. I felt the mattress shift and registered her presence and drifted back under. But before I did, in that 30-second window of partial awareness, something registered. She smelled wrong. Not like perfume or alcohol or anything with a specific name. She smelled like a hotel room. The particular combination of recycled air and institutional soap and a kind of neutralized anonymity that has no place in a domestic bedroom. It was subtle enough that I could have slept through it without registering it consciously. But I was in that half-awake state where the body's senses operate without the mind's filtering, and what reached me was unambiguous. I lay still in the dark for a long time. In the morning, she was up before me, coffee made, showered, hair done, standing at the kitchen counter in work clothes when I came downstairs. She was telling me about the presentation, how it had gone, a small anecdote about a projector that had failed at a critical moment, whether the client seemed satisfied. She looked rested. She looked the way someone looks when they have slept well in a comfortable place, which is not the same as how someone looks after midnight preparation for a morning presentation. I sat across from her with my coffee, and I studied her face the way you study a document when you're looking for a discrepancy, carefully, without showing that you're looking. She met my eyes naturally. She laughed at her own projector story. She asked about my site visit, whether I thought the foundation issue on the Crestwood project had been resolved. She was entirely, perfectly normal. And I understood, for the first time, with a clarity that arrived without drama or heat, that I was looking at a very accomplished performance. I went to work. I sat at my desk with my door closed, which I rarely did, and I thought. Not frantically. I am not, by temperament, a person who spirals. I thought the way I thought through a project problem, systematically, from first principles, without assumptions I couldn't support. What did I know? What did I not know? What would I need in order to know the difference? After 20 minutes, I picked up my phone and called her office's main number. I asked to be connected to Emily's extension. The receptionist paused, and then, "I'm sorry, Emily left around 4:30 yesterday. Would you like to leave a message?" 4:30. The final prep had required her until past midnight. She had left at 4:30. I set the phone on my desk and looked at it for a moment. Through my office window, I could see the open-plan floor, people at desks, a cluster of three around a whiteboard, someone's phone ringing unanswered. All of it was continuing exactly as it should. The world was entirely undisturbed by what I had just learned. I had a site meeting at 11. I went to it. I resolved a drainage issue and approved a revised timeline and drove back to the office and answered 7 emails and sat through a budget review. I was present for all of it. And underneath all of it, the specific quiet of a man who has just had the ground shift beneath him and has decided, very deliberately, not to fall. That evening I asked her how the presentation had gone. She said, well, the client had approved the revised concept with only minor changes. I said I was glad. I asked if she was hungry. She said starving. I ordered Thai food and we ate it on the couch and watched something neither of us was really watching, and I said nothing. I had nothing to say yet. What I had was a confirmed discrepancy and a decision. I was going to find out exactly what was happening before I said a single word. I want to be honest about why I made that choice, because it wasn't only tactical. It was also self-protective in a way I didn't fully acknowledge at the time. As long as I was gathering information rather than confronting what the information meant, I could exist in a state of purposeful action rather than grief. Investigation is organized. It gives you somewhere to put the energy that has no other outlet. I think part of me understood that the moment I stopped investigating and started knowing, a different kind of accounting would begin, and I wasn't ready for it yet. So I started looking. I began with what was accessible. Emily's phone remained the primary obstacle. She had changed her passcode in the spring, a fact I had noted and set aside and now understood completely, and the biometric login meant the device was always a thumbprint away from opening, but only hers. However, she was not uniformly careful. On weekday mornings, when she was moving quickly between shower and hair and coffee and the logistics of getting out the door, she occasionally left the phone on the bathroom counter between tasks. Unlocked, because she had just used it, set down while she went to retrieve something from the bedroom. I waited for one of those mornings. It took 4 days. On a Wednesday, she set the phone face up on the bathroom counter and went back to the bedroom for her earrings. I had maybe 90 seconds. I didn't browse. I knew exactly what I was looking for and I found it in 30, because once you are looking for a specific kind of message thread, you recognize it instantly. Not from the content, from the architecture, the brevity, the rhythm, the particular compression of language between people who are communicating around the edges of something larger, saying less than they mean because they are confident the other person will fill the space correctly. The name at the top of the thread was Mark. I read enough to confirm what I had already half known. I put the phone back exactly where it had been, in precisely the same orientation. I went downstairs. I poured coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard maple, which had just begun turning at the edges, and I breathed steadily and thought, now I know. Now I need everything else. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel relieved. What I felt was a strange, cold settling. The specific sensation of a hypothesis confirmed, which carries no satisfaction because the hypothesis was never one you wanted to be right about. The GPS tracker arrived 2 days later in an unmarked package, ordered from an electronics retailer under circumstances I had thought through carefully. It was small, roughly the diameter of a large coin, an inch thick, with a magnetic backing and a battery life the product description claimed was 30 days. On a Sunday afternoon while Emily was inside on a call, I went out to the car to check the tire pressure, something I did periodically and unremarkably, and attached the tracker to the underside of the rear wheel arch, held by its magnet against the inner frame. It took 11 seconds. The companion app on my phone updated every 15 minutes by default. I set it to every 5. Over the following 2 weeks, the tracker told a story that was precise and unambiguous. On Tuesday evenings and Thursday evenings, the late work nights, Emily drove downtown, turned left on Meridian Avenue instead of right toward the highway home, and stopped in a parking structure adjacent to the Meridian Grand Hotel. She stayed between 90 minutes and 2 hours and 40 minutes. The departures were inconsistent enough to suggest they weren't scheduled to a clock. The destination was not. On the third Tuesday, I drove to Meridian Avenue at 5:30 and parked in a surface lot across the street from the hotel entrance, where I had a clear sight line to the main doors and the adjacent parking structure exit. I brought a coffee and a book I didn't open, and I waited. At 6:12, Emily's car exited the structure and turned toward the highway. At 6:18, a man I didn't recognize exited the hotel's main entrance, paused on the sidewalk to check his phone, and walked to the parking structure. He was somewhere in his early 40s, tall, dark coat, the particular unhurried pace of someone who was neither early nor late. I photographed him through my windshield with my phone zoomed to maximum. The image was usable. I went home and searched Emily's company website for a senior account manager named Mark. The photograph in his staff bio was small and professionally lit, but it was the same man. I sat with my laptop open on the kitchen table for a long time. The following Thursday, I returned to Meridian Avenue, but this time I arrived earlier and positioned myself in the hotel's lobby, not the main entrance, but a secondary lounge area accessible from a side corridor, partially screened by a column and a row of tall planters. I was dressed in work clothes and had my laptop open and was entirely unremarkable, just another person using hotel Wi-Fi between meetings. The lobby had perhaps a dozen people in it over the course of the 90 minutes I was there. At 6:04, Emily came in through the main entrance. She walked directly to the elevator bank without stopping at the desk. She pressed the button with the comfort of someone who has done this many times. She was carrying her work bag over one shoulder, and she was wearing the new earrings, the ones she'd bought and worn twice, the style she'd told me she didn't like. She looked composed and purposeful and completely at ease, which was the detail that lodged itself most deeply in me and stayed. I photographed her from the lounge, partially obscured by the planter. The image showed her clearly: face, bag, the earrings. I photographed her again from a slightly different angle as she waited for the elevator, and in the second image you could see Mark arriving through the main entrance behind her, 30 seconds later, and the brief exchange between them as the elevator doors opened. Not a greeting exactly, something more private than that, a shared look that belonged to a different world than the one I occupied. I had the photographs. I had the GPS records, time-stamped and mapped. I had the phone messages, partially, enough to confirm the relationship without having a complete record. What I needed was something more definitive, something that could not be explained away or contextualized differently in a conversation where Emily had time to construct her response. The video came from the fourth visit, a Tuesday in mid-November. I had refined my position in the lobby by then, understood the rhythms of the space, knew where the cameras were and which angles they covered. I was there when they arrived, separately, as always, 3 minutes apart, and I filmed them from across the lobby as they waited for the elevator together. 47 seconds of footage. In those 47 seconds, he said something to her that made her laugh and drop her head forward slightly. And then she raised her face, and he touched her jaw with 2 fingers in a gesture so ordinary and so intimate that it could only belong to people who had touched each other many times. And she let it happen with a complete ease that told me everything about how long this had been going on and how little she thought about the life she was conducting it alongside. I walked out of the hotel, got into my car, drove 3 blocks, and stopped. I sat there for a while, not thinking clearly, for once, just sitting. Then I drove home and made dinner, and when Emily came in at 7:45 with her work bag over her shoulder and a plausible story about a budget revision that had consumed the evening, I asked if she was hungry, and she said yes, and we ate together at the kitchen table, and I was very careful to be exactly who she expected me to be. That night, I created a folder on my phone inside a utility app she had never opened, and I moved everything into it: the photographs, the GPS exports, the video, the screenshots from the morning she had left her phone unlocked. I labeled the folder with a name that meant nothing. I went to sleep before she did, which was unusual, and I lay in the dark and listened to the house and thought about what I was going to do with everything I had built. There was one more development before December, and it came from a direction I hadn't anticipated. Emily's sister Carol called me on a Saturday afternoon in late November while Emily was at the gym or wherever she was on Saturday mornings. Carol and I had always gotten along well, had the comfortable ease of people who share family without friction. She called, she said, to ask about Christmas plans. We talked about that for a few minutes, and then she said, with a careful casualness that I immediately recognized as prepared, "Is everything okay with you too?" Emily seemed kind of, I don't know, preoccupied. I said we were fine, just busy. She said she was glad. There was a pause, and then she mentioned she's been under a lot of stress at work. New manager or something. "Mark," I said, Another pause. Shorter, but different. Yeah, Carol said. She's mentioned him a few times. I didn't push it. Carol wasn't going to tell me anything directly. She was Emily's sister, and whatever she suspected, her loyalty was clear. But the fact that she had called told me something. Carol was not a person who made social calls without reason. She had been checking on me, which meant she knew, or suspected, enough to feel that I might need checking on. After we hung up, I sat with that for a long time. Carol's call changed something in my calculus. It told me the situation had a perimeter larger than I had mapped, that people adjacent to my marriage knew something, or sensed something, that I had been carefully kept from knowing. The performance Emily had been maintaining was not only directed at me. She had been managing multiple audiences, and the management was imperfect, which meant it was closer to its natural conclusion than I had realized. I made a decision that evening. I would not initiate the ending. I would wait for her to give me the opportunity she was clearly already building toward, and I would meet it on my terms, with everything I had gathered. If she was planning something, an exit, a conversation, a controlled disclosure, I would let her begin it, and then I would finish it. 3 days later, she asked if I wanted to have dinner. Just us. She named the restaurant. Alcott's, the place on the river we had gone for our third date. She said she wanted to talk. Just the two of us. Something nice for a change. I said that sounded perfect. I said I was looking forward to it. The week before the dinner, I went through everything once more. Not because I doubted what I had. I didn't. But because I am someone who checks his work before a critical meeting, who runs through variables when the stakes are high, who does not walk into a consequential situation without having thought through every likely response. I reviewed the GPS exports, the photographs, the 47-second video. I reviewed the screenshots from the phone. I arranged them in a sequence that told a story efficiently and irrefutably, in the order a person would need to encounter them to be unable to construct a counter-narrative. I thought about what Emily would say. I had been married to her for 9 years. I knew how she argued, not aggressively, but with a sophisticated awareness of narrative control, a tendency to reframe rather than deny, to move the ground of a conversation toward terrain where she was more comfortable. She was good at it. In 9 years of marriage, it had served us well in most disagreements because her instinct was usually toward resolution. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose, and I had prepared for that. I had also prepared for the possibility that she would make a disclosure of her own, that the dinner was, in fact, her chosen moment to tell me something. She had, after all, said she wanted to talk. She might be planning to confess. She might have decided, for whatever reason, that this was the night she took control of the narrative by surfacing it herself. If that happened, I would let her speak, and then I would show her what I had, and we would both understand that the narrative was no longer hers to control. I dressed carefully on the evening of December 14th. Not formally, just clean and considered, the dark jacket she had always said she liked. I found the note she'd left on the counter. Tonight is just for us, and read it one more time before putting it in my pocket. Then I got in the car and drove to Alcott's. She was already there when I arrived, which surprised me slightly. Emily tended to arrive at things at exactly the right moment, neither early nor late. She was at our corner table, the one she had requested, with 2 glasses of wine already poured. She had done her hair carefully. She was wearing the blue dress. She looked, if I am being honest, beautiful, which was its own specific kind of pain, the kind that doesn't diminish the clarity of what you know but coexists with it in a way that is very hard to explain to anyone who hasn't felt it. She stood when I reached the table and kissed my cheek and said she was glad I was there. I said I was glad too. I sat down and picked up my wine glass and looked at her across the candle and thought, here we are. The first 20 minutes were almost peaceful. She had clearly prepared for this evening the way she prepared for presentations, with an awareness of what effect she was building toward and patience for the process. She asked about my week. She asked about the Crestwood project. She refilled my wine without being asked. She was warm and present and attentive in a way that felt, genuinely, like the Emily I had known before all of this, the one who made spaces feel considered and made people feel like the only person in the room. I answered her questions. I asked some of my own. I ate my food. I watched her. She began to move toward it somewhere around the main course. Her energy shifted slightly, became more careful, more intentional. She reached across the table and touched my hand and said, I feel like we've been really distant lately. I feel like I've been absent. I want to fix that. I looked at her hand on mine. I said, "What do you mean by absent?" "Just distracted. Work has been consuming. I haven't been giving us the attention we deserve." She held my eyes steadily. "I want to do better. I think we should maybe look at taking a trip, just us, in January. Reset a little." There it was. The offer. The forward-looking gesture that creates momentum away from the territory you don't want examined. January. A trip. A reset. It was elegant, in its way. It was almost exactly what she had done on the May porch with the beer and the shoulder and the easy, companionable silence. A moment of genuine warmth deployed as a kind of structural misdirection, pulling your attention towards something real while something else moved in the periphery. I had seen it then and not recognized it. I recognized it now. "I want to ask you something first," I said. She held her expression steady. "Of course. How long have you been seeing Mark?" The table went very quiet. It's an interesting thing, watching a person's face in the moment they understand that the architecture of a deception has collapsed. It doesn't look like a single expression. It looks like a rapid sequence of them, too fast for deliberate control. The first is pure surprise. The second is something calculating. The third is something that might, in a different context, have been grief. Emily went through all three in perhaps 2 seconds and then arrived at a version of composure that was largely assembled from its components rather than felt. "Ryan, please don't," I said. Not harshly, calmly. "I'm not asking so you can figure out what I know. I'm asking because it's a straightforward question and I'd like a straightforward answer." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How did you?" "I have GPS records going back 10 weeks, I said. "I have photographs. I have messages from the morning you left your phone on the bathroom counter." I paused. "And I have video." I set my phone on the table and turned it so the screen faced her. The 47-second clip was already cued. I pressed play and let her watch it. She watched it without moving. The hotel lobby, the elevator, the moment he touched her jaw and she let him. 47 seconds. When it ended, the table was completely still. Around us, the restaurant continued. Other tables, other conversations, the sound of silverware and low music, and someone near the window laughing at something. All of it entirely indifferent to what was happening at the corner table. "How long?" I asked again. She looked at the table for a moment. When she looked up, something had changed in her expression. The assembled composure was gone, replaced by something rawer and more difficult to manage. "Since March," she said. "March." I had found the phone behavior starting in April, which meant by the time I noticed, she had already been doing this for a month. My first registered signal had been a month late. "Were you planning to tell me?" She pressed her lips together. "I don't know. Were you planning to ask for a divorce?" She stopped. "I don't know, Ryan. I've been confused." You've been staying at the Meridian Grand on Tuesday and Thursday evenings," I said. "You've been spending money on it that I haven't tracked because I trusted you. You told me you were working." I kept my voice level. Not cold, level. "There is a difference. You were not working." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, I know exactly what I did. I'm not going to try to justify it. I'm not asking you to justify it." "Then what are you asking?" I picked up my phone, turned the screen off, and put it back in my pocket. "I'm not asking anything anymore. I've already talked to a lawyer. I'll be filing next week." I looked at her. "I wanted to tell you in person. I thought you deserved that." The composure broke then, not theatrically, not in the way that invites sympathy management, but in the quiet way that real distress expresses itself when there is no audience left to manage. Her chin trembled slightly. She looked like someone who had walked into a room expecting one thing and found something irrevocably different. "Ryan," she said. Her voice had changed, smaller, something stripped back in it. I know you have every reason. But I need you to know that what I did doesn't change what we had." "It doesn't change. It changes what we have," I said. "Going forward. That's what it changes." She was quiet. She was looking at me with an expression I had not seen before, or perhaps one I had seen once, years ago, when something had hurt her and she had been trying not to show it. I held her eyes and felt the complicated grief of looking at someone you have loved genuinely and completely and understanding that you are also someone they chose to deceive for 11 months. Both things were true simultaneously. Neither canceled the other. I stood, reached into my jacket, and left enough cash on the table to cover dinner and a generous tip. I put on my coat. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said. I meant it. Whatever that says about me, I meant it. I walked out of Alcott's and into the cold December night and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing. The river was visible at the end of the block, flat and dark, the lights of the far bank reflected in thin, broken lines across the water. It was very cold. It was very quiet. I walked to my car and drove home. The legal process was, as these things go, relatively contained. I had retained Jennifer Marsh 6 weeks before the dinner, a family law attorney recommended by a colleague who had navigated a difficult divorce 2 years prior. Jennifer was methodical, experienced, and communicated in the direct register of someone who has seen every version of this situation and has no investment in the emotional narrative, only the practical outcome. The first meeting had been largely organizational, what I had, what I wanted, what the realistic parameters were. She had looked at my documentation folder with the neutral appreciation of someone receiving exactly what they need. "This is thorough," she said, which was the closest she came to a compliment. Emily retained her own attorney, a man named Paul who Jennifer knew professionally and described only as adequate, which I took to be an assessment. The process moved through its required stages. There were negotiations over the house. We agreed to sell and split the equity, which was straightforward. There were no children to complicate the custody calculus, which was both a relief and its own specific sadness when I thought about it too directly. The financial settlement was clean given the documentation I had on the joint account spending, which Emily did not contest. She attempted contact 3 times outside the legal channel. The first was a text, sent on a Sunday evening 2 weeks after the dinner. "I keep thinking about everything. I know there's nothing to say that changes things, but I wanted you to know that I'm in therapy now. I'm trying to understand myself better. I'm sorry, Ryan. I really am." I read it twice. I did not reply. The second was a phone call in January, which I let go to voicemail. Her message was brief. She had found some of my things in the garage she thought I might want. She would leave them on the porch. She hoped I was okay. She said my name at the end, just once, the way you say someone's name when you are not sure you have the right to say it anymore. The third was a letter, handwritten, which arrived in February in an envelope I recognized immediately from her handwriting on the front. I sat with it unopened for 2 days before I read it. It was 3 pages, careful and honest and painful in the specific way that honest accounting of damage always is. She had written things I believed she meant. She had written things that would have mattered enormously 8 months earlier. I held the letter for a long time after I finished reading it, and then I put it in the same folder as the GPS records and the photographs and the 47-second video, and I closed the folder, and I went and made dinner. The divorce was finalized in late March. Jennifer called me on a Tuesday afternoon to confirm it, her tone businesslike and conclusive, which was exactly right. I sold my share of the house and moved into a rented apartment on the east side of the city, a second-floor unit with large windows and good light and a kitchen that was smaller than I was used to but sufficient. I spent a weekend making it feel like somewhere I would actually want to be, not in Emily's way, not with that specific considered eye she had, but adequately. Plants in 2 places. Books on actual shelves. The coffee maker on the counter where it was easy to reach. I went back to work with the particular focus of someone who has simplified their life considerably. The Crestwood project wrapped in April. I took on a new account in May that was the most complex thing I had managed in 3 years, the kind of problem that requires your full attention and therefore generously crowds out everything else. I was good at it. I was, for the first time and longer than I could accurately date, fully present in my own professional life rather than somewhere adjacent to it. Mike, my oldest friend from college, took me camping in June, a long weekend in the mountains 3 hours north of the city. We fished badly and cooked over a camp stove and talked about almost nothing important, which was precisely the correct amount of importance for that particular weekend. Driving back through the mountain pass on Sunday evening with the windows down and the pine smell coming in and the radio playing something forgettable, I felt something I had to think about for a moment before I could name it. Light. Not happiness exactly. Not yet, or not straightforwardly. But a lightness. The specific sensation of a person who has set down something heavy and is only now, miles later, noticing the absence of the weight. I thought about the note on the kitchen counter. "Tonight is just for us." I thought about how she had placed it next to my coffee cup, knowing I would find it in the morning, in the specific spot where I always set my mug. That knowledge, the knowledge of where I put my coffee cup, was an intimacy, and she had used it in the service of a deception, And the conjunction of those two facts was something I had turned over many times without ever fully resolving it. You don't stop knowing someone simply because they have wronged you. The knowledge accumulates and stays. What changes is only what you do with it. I had done what needed doing with it. There are things I think about still, not obsessively but honestly. The way you think about a significant period of your life that had its own weather and its own logic. I think about the Friday evening in May on the back porch, the beer in the shoulder, and the sense of refine that I had felt so completely. I understand now that I was not wrong to feel it. Whatever else was true, something real was also present in that moment. The two things coexisted, which is not a comfort exactly, but it is an accuracy, and accuracy is what I prefer now to comfort. I think about Carol's phone call in November, the careful casualness of a person checking on someone she suspected needed checking on. I never spoke to Carol after the divorce was finalized. There was no occasion, and it would have been strange to manufacture one. But I think well of her for making that call. She did what she could within the constraints of her loyalty, and I understood the constraints. I think about the moment in the hotel lobby when he touched her jaw with two fingers, and she let him. I have thought about that gesture a great deal, not because it was the most damaging piece of evidence I gathered, but because it told me something that the GPS records and the phone messages didn't. Something about duration and familiarity and the specific ease of two people who have been doing something for long enough that it no longer requires thought. It told me this was not a momentary lapse or a single bad decision amplified by circumstance. It was a life she had built in the space alongside mine, with its own rhythms and its own intimacies. That understanding was the most disorienting part, not the betrayal itself, but the scale of what had been constructed and maintained in the negative space of my trust. The apartment on the east side is home now, genuinely. Not a temporary place, not a transitional stage, home. I have learned things about my own domesticity that 12 years of shared life had obscured. I prefer mornings quiet. I cook better when I'm the only one I'm cooking for. I sleep with the window open even in October. These are small things, but they are entirely mine in a way that the large things, the house, the shared account, the 12-year rhythm, never quite were or never quite felt. I am not going to say I am better for what happened. That framing has always seemed to me slightly dishonest. A retrofitted narrative that converts damage into meaning in a way that papers over the actual cost. What happened cost me something real, something I had genuinely built and genuinely valued, and the loss of that is real and will remain real regardless of what comes after it. What I will say is that I know myself differently now. I know what I ignored and why I ignored it, and what the ignoring cost me. I know the specific mechanics of a comfort zone that functions as a blind spot. How the desire to believe in something can disable the very faculties that would tell you the truth about it. I know how to read a pause before a phone is picked up. I know what a hotel room smells like when it arrives home in someone else's hair at midnight. These are not things I asked to know, but I know them, and I use them, and they make me someone with better instruments than the person who stood in the kitchen doorway in April watching Emily load the dishwasher and felt, briefly, that familiar unease, and then let it go. Mason, a colleague's son, 9 years old, asked me once at a company picnic what I did when something was hard. I told him I worked on it until it wasn't. He thought about this seriously and said, "What if it takes a long time?" I said, "Then you get good at the waiting." He nodded like that made sense. I think it does. What this story describes, at its core, is the gap between the marriage as a living institution and the marriage as a belief system, and what happens when those two things diverge completely. For 11 months, Ryan and Emily occupied the same house, shared the same routines, slept in the same bed, and were participating in two entirely different realities. Ryan was living inside the marriage he believed he had. Emily was living inside the marriage she was managing, maintaining its surface with enough fidelity to prevent examination while constructing something separate in its negative space. The extraordinary thing is not that this divergence occurred, but that it was sustained for so long without collision. It was sustained because Ryan's trust was so complete that it functioned as a kind of structural support for her deception. His willingness to believe removed the need for her to be particularly careful. His instinct to reach for the innocent explanation, time after time, bought her months. This is not a moral failure on Ryan's part. It is a human one. We extend trust to people we love not because we are naive, but because trust is the precondition for intimacy. You cannot have one without something like the other. The problem is that trust, once extended generously, becomes a resource that can be drawn upon by someone operating in bad faith. Emily did not manufacture Ryan's trust. She inherited it from 9 years of genuine relationship, and she spent it. That distinction matters. The trust was real. Its exploitation was a choice she made separately. What the story ultimately reveals about Emily is something more complicated than simple selfishness. The letter she wrote in February, the 3 careful pages that arrived after everything was over, suggests a person capable of genuine reflection who exercised that capacity too late and in the wrong direction for too long. The therapy she mentioned, the language of trying to understand herself, the specific honesty of the letter's accounting. None of this is performance. It is real, and it coexists with 11 months of deliberate deception, with the earrings she bought for him and wore in her own house, with the note "Tonight is just for us" placed beside a coffee cup whose location she knew precisely because she had known this man for 9 years. Both things are true simultaneously. That is the part that resists simplification. What this story describes, at its core, is the gap between the marriage as a living institution and the marriage as a belief system, and what happens when those two things diverge completely. For 11 months, Ryan and Emily occupied the same house, shared the same routines, slept in the same bed, and were participating in 2 entirely different realities. Ryan was living inside the marriage he believed he had. Emily was living inside the marriage she was managing, maintaining its surface with enough fidelity to prevent examination while constructing something separate in its negative space. The extraordinary thing is not that this divergence occurred, but that it was sustained for so long without collision. It was sustained because Ryan's trust was so complete that it functioned as a kind of structural support for her deception. His willingness to believe removed the need for her to be particularly careful. His instinct to reach for the innocent explanation, time after time, bought her months. This is not a moral failure on Ryan's part. It is a human one. We extend trust to people we love not because we are naive, but because trust is the precondition for intimacy. You cannot have one without something like the other. The problem is that trust, once extended generously, becomes a resource that can be drawn upon by someone operating in bad faith. Emily did not manufacture Ryan's trust. She inherited it from 9 years of genuine relationship, and she spent it. That distinction matters. The trust was real. Its exploitation was a choice she made separately. What the story ultimately reveals about Emily is something more complicated than simple selfishness. The letter she wrote in February, the 3 careful pages that arrived after everything was over, suggests a person capable of genuine reflection who exercised that capacity too late and in the wrong direction for too long. The therapy she mentioned, the language of trying to understand herself, the specific honesty of the letter's accounting. None of this is performance. It is real, and it coexists with 11 months of deliberate deception, with the earrings she bought for him and wore in her own house, with the note "Tonight is just for us" placed beside a coffee cup whose location she knew precisely because she had known this man for 9 years. Both things are true simultaneously. That is the part that resists simplification. What strikes me most about this story isn't the evidence Ryan gathered, or even the dinner. It's the note she left on the counter that morning. "Tonight is just for us." She wrote it. She placed it next to his coffee cup. She knew exactly where he kept his cup, and she had been sleeping with someone else for 9 months. I think about what it takes to write a note like that, not strategically, but without even registering the contradiction. That's the part that reveals the most about how deep the compartmentalization had gone. She wasn't lying in that moment, exactly. She meant it. She wanted the evening. She wanted to try to repair something she had also been actively destroying. People are capable of holding those two things simultaneously for much longer than we expect. And the person who suffers for it is always the one who was only doing one thing at a time. Ryan was only ever doing one thing at a time. That, in the end, was both his blind spot and his integrity.